Morning, everyone. Today's session will be looking at the impact of foreign direct investments in African economies, as well as partnerships to boost growth and also enhance competitiveness. But before we begin, I'd like to engage you for a second. Please engage me. Lift your hand to the choice that you relate to the most. So if Africa's economy were a social media platform, which one would it be? Will it be Facebook for its vast network and potential for connections? If that's you, please raise up your hand. I mean, you can choose more than one. You can choose more than one. So if you feel like it, yes. So I'll go again. Is it Facebook for its vast network and potential for connections? Twitter for its rapid growth and trending topics? LinkedIn for its human capital, numerous job and professional development opportunities? Or TikTok for its youthful energy and innovative content? So how many for Facebook? Okay. Twitter? LinkedIn? Okay. TikTok? Great. So with that, it's with great honor to introduce our panelists for today. We have Dr. Dorothy Nyambi, CEO at Mennonite Economic Development Associates, an international economic development organization that uses financial and technical expertise to build and enhance agri-food systems that provide decent work for systematically marginalized communities. We also have on stage Dr. Elsa Zekeng, a scientist, entrepreneur, policy advocate, and founder for Soka Data, a startup increasing equity in clinical trials for women, Black, and ethnic minority groups. Thank you for joining us today. So to kick off our discussion, I'd like to paint a picture of where we are as a continent with FDI. So last year in 2024, foreign direct investment in Africa reached a record of $94 billion, driven by the Ras El Hekma Peninsula Development Project in Egypt. If we take this out, we still saw a 23% rise in FDI, totaling about $50 billion to the continent. So to my panelists, Africa is continuing to play a role in the global economy, an increasing role in supply chains, primarily as a supplier of raw materials, a growing manufacturing hub, and a rising consumer market. What is the status of supply chains in Africa, particularly in food, healthcare, and petroleum sectors, and how do these impact the continent's economic landscape?
You want to go first? You can do it. Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to participate in this conversation and contribute to it. As Miriam stated, of course, I'm a scientist, and so everything that I would say will probably be specifically through the lens of health, science, and technology, because my startup is also a tech startup. And so from that perspective, when we're talking about what is the status of where we currently sit, and within that health landscape, now, health is such a pillar in almost everything that we do, right, and society that we live in. However, when we look at health predominantly within the African context, you tend to really focus on an out-of-pocket experience, which is very much reliant on you having to pay for that. Contrary to that, or you put that juxtaposed towards the fact that when you look at research, for example, it's also heavily reliant on aid, right? And that is aid from quite a lot of foundations and a lot of organizations. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of budding opportunities that are coming up within the context, but when you're looking at this current landscape that we live in, because of this heavy reliance on either yourself as an individual or on foreign aid, we are currently seeing I don't want to say the backlash, but we're currently seeing with the changing political landscape within the US, how that is affecting that investment from that perspective. So I think that we sit at at a juncture where we realize that, yes, Africa has such health potential. We have the greatest minds. I know so many of them to be able to bring up that human capital and that knowledge to be able to advance discoveries of vaccines, of new drugs, of new technology. But then we need the ecosystem to be able to support that. And so you end up finding yourself in a situation where you have to both create the ecosystem at the same time as actually creating the innovation. And we really stand at a space where we get to decide what is the future going to be when we're seeing what is happening within the different political landscapes. So I will pause there.
Thank you.
No, thanks again, Miriam, and thanks to the Said Business School for this invite. I think it was very interesting for me when we said, which social media platform would Africa represent? And most hands went up for Twitter. And, I'm sitting back here and I say, do we really think that in Africa we have the systems in place, the infrastructure that would allow us to be a Twitter continent and we'll make it? So, I'm just asking again that, if you can give some thoughts to, are we really ready to be a Twitter continent? Because think about it, I live in Canada, when there is so much of a system in place, the infrastructure. I heard yesterday from Farouk, he said that infrastructure, for us to actually leverage technology on this continent, if we don't have the backbone that is needed, right? For Twitter, we need power, we need high-speed internet, right? So those things are mortar and bricks infrastructure. So I wanted to just touch back again and say, let's continue to reflect on what is it that, is going to take Africa to the next level. But coming back to your question, Miriam, about where do I think that we are as Africa? Again, interesting, before I answer that, the question around, should we pay more attention internally or externally? The first question that I think Laura asked, before we started. It was very interesting. And I was one of those who voted that we should pay attention externally. So I didn't speak then, so let me speak up now. And the reason I did that was because, we will continue to be the producer of raw materials unless we become the continent that can actually industrialize, have finished product, add value. We do it because we need it, and we do it because the world needs it. I really want to see Africa become the continent that serves Africa and serves the world. Right now, the narrative is all about let Africa fix itself. We're going to fix ourselves and we're going to fix the world, right? Because we have the ability to serve ourselves and to serve the world. So I want to be able to do the finished product, grow my cacao in Côte d'Ivoire, do the best chocolate, and sell it to the rest of the world, right? Because as an Ivorian, chocolate is not part of my diet. Right? So, I'm going to be able to sell it. So I don't want to do that and just give out the raw material. So it comes back again to those value chains and everything. We want to be able to feed ourselves, but we want to be able to bring value addition, take things to the finish line. And just like Elsa said, where I'm coming at it, it's at the economic development perspective. And so for that to happen, we need to have health, we need to have education. I'm not going there. Those are the fundamentals. It's a given. We cannot move economically in Africa without building the system, and that system is the education system, it's our healthcare system, it's our finance system. Then we're going to take that and overlay in the things that we want to do. And I just want to end by saying, again, I think it was Farouk from TGI yesterday, just talking about the simple things. We shouldn't wait that everything has to be a big thing. Everybody where they see it, no matter how small, is to start. What kills us in Africa is that things start small, they remain small, and they die small. Right? So, and it doesn't mean that every society has to have lots of big things, but it is that transition, that pathway where people can evolve. Their businesses, their opportunities that they do. So I'll pause there for now, but I really think that where it sits, Africa needs to prepare itself to be a global player. I hear a lot about, we're training Africans in Oxford to go back to Africa. Yes, we want people to go back to Africa, but I want people from Africa who studied in Oxford to go and run companies in Japan. There's nothing wrong in that.
Thank you so much. So the key insights we're getting is we need to build a system. There are few points that have been raised. I would love to come back, reliance on aid, beginning small, remaining small, and dying small. We'll get back to that. But on that topic of moving high up the global value chain, what strategies do you think as African countries we can adapt to move beyond primary commodities, as you've mentioned, Dr. Nyambi, or just recipients of externally manufactured healthcare products as opposed to manufacturing them ourselves? I would love to hear more about what strategies can we start employing to move beyond just primary commodities or just recipients of end products in the healthcare field.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think, again, as I said, I wouldn't touch about, sort of education is fundamental. You have to have your education system, and that education system needs not just, yes, bricks and mortar. Now, education can be done in so many different ways. Technology, all those things are going to overlay. But I'm going to be one of those who is going to always say, get the infrastructure right before you bring the technology. Get the infrastructure right before you bring the different kinds of finance that is needed. But I think for me, Miriam, one of the things that is really going to be key is our ability to use a business lens and to bring in finance. Right, so there's a lot of talk about, there's social finance, there's business, but if we look around the world globally, whether from the Southeast Asian giants, how they went from where they were 30 years ago to where they are today. I do a lot of work in Latin America as well, and Central America, and see where they are and everything. None of those places moved to where they were without a really strong investment in the business sector, and that included bringing in money. And it's different kinds of money. If you look at the spectrum, not everybody needs the same kind of money. There's people who may need some microloans, there's some people who may need, big infrastructure grants, that they're going to have to get it from the African Development Bank. But that brings me to a little bit, I was talking to Mildred earlier, what we're calling the missing middle. That we really need to build the ecosystem. Because lots of programs focus on, I'm going to help the poor woman, I'll give them $100. There's a lot of people giving out $100 to do microloans and everything. Then there's a group of people on this side who are trying to give, they say, well, if you cannot take BII, if you cannot take 10 million or 50 million, there's no place for us to talk to you, right? So we are coming in the middle to say people need to evolve, and that, for these value chains, whether it's education value chain, health value chain, pharmaceutic value chain, agri-value chain, how do we bring in capital that is structured to meet people where they are? The other thing is capital. A lot of capital is structured to do what we, the capital holders, want to do. And we are trying to, at MIDA, and working with the MasterCard Foundation in Africa through the MasterCard Foundation African Growth Fund, we're actually trying to reverse that narrative. We want to structure the finance to meet people where they are, so that the finance can work for you versus us coming with our rules and regulations for that finance. So I think for me, it is really understanding the ecosystem and then bringing in pools of capital that would work. But the last thing I want to say is that there is capital on the African continent. Capital doesn't have to be external all the time. And the one thing that we also do in the African Growth Fund is we insist that any person we work with has to be domiciled on the African continent. And so what does this mean? This means that you cannot keep your money in Luxembourg. You bring it, it works for you in Africa, and then you take all the interest, you go pay yourself, and you live well in Luxembourg. What it means is that the money has to be domiciled in Nairobi, in Kampala. A lot of people are domiciling the money in Mauritius. Kigali is coming up as a financial center. We did some studies. We looked at Cote d'Ivoire, we looked at Senegal, we looked at Cabo Verde, we looked at Ethiopia. So we are really trying to make sure that we build the infrastructure so that the money that is in Africa can actually domicile in Africa. And this would allow our local pension funds, local capital, our local high net worth individuals who don't want to deal with foreign exchange to put their money so that let the money of Africa begin to actually work to help to build these value chains and so we can go from just raw material to finished product, and we can do trade finance, we can do working capital, So many things. The brains are there, you know, many of them sitting in this room, in so many rooms like this across the world.
Okay, so when we talk about what strategies, right, I will aim to bring a more lived experience context, which hopefully, I mean, it is the truth, so it is what it is. And let me paint a story of the year is 2015. The Ebola epidemic is happening, the biggest one in West Africa. There's a lot of panic going on as to what this new virus is, what does this mean for the continent, and what does this mean for the world, and what does this mean for the people who are dying, and how do we stop this? Now, I think I'm in my second year of my PhD. I end up deploying to Guinea with the WHO, with Public Health England, and working with different organizations on ground. We spent 6 weeks working on ground every day at the front lines, testing patients for Ebola and malaria. Now, the context that is usually missing is that where we were staying was an infrastructure that was built 2 hours from Conakry, and it had to be stood up within about 6 weeks. Our lab was not a concrete-based lab. Our lab was powered by generators that were all brought in. The hoods we were working in were literally boxes, and they were sealed with tape over and over again. We had to be in full PPE in the sun, and every day we had protocol we had to follow. We could not hug anyone, we could not touch anyone, because you're literally testing a sample and you do not know if they have Ebola or malaria or nothing. The reality of that is that it does something to you, yes, physically, but more emotionally, and understanding where we really sit in when we're talking about infrastructure. It's great that we talk about, yes, we should do all of this, but what does this mean, one, in a crisis moment, but generally on a continuous level? When we talk about strategies, unfortunately or fortunately, our governments have a role to play in being able to, yes, deploy and invest within certain systems. We can bring in business lenses, we can bring in all the capital that we can, but literally having to fly and create something, the amount of risk that you're putting people at every single time, it should not be acceptable. We have things like our government signed Abuja Declaration over 20 years ago, stating that every African government needs to donate at least 15% of its GDP towards healthcare infrastructure. At the moment, South Africa is leading that with 8%. Cameroon, where I'm from, 3.8%, Nigeria, about 4%. Because these infrastructures are missing, when we come to talk about building on the layer of innovation, all of these things, who is taking care of that foundational layer? Usually it's standing on the backs of people like 22-year-old Elsa, whose mother was like, you are not going to Guinea. And of course, eventually I did go. I was able to be like, Mom, please. And my dad came in as well and supported me. But it's standing on the backs of people who are willing to, in that moment, go, okay, let's see what we need to do. I've had the pleasure of engaging with so many greats, the likes of, obviously, Rebecca Nonchong, Ken yesterday, and just learning about the roles that they're playing in building. I think Rebecca was talking about a digital caravan, right? And having a global, like a portable makeshift studio, having to go around to different institutions, different spaces and teach this is what is happening. It should not be left to that external investment to be able to do that. I mean, it's amazing that she's doing it, and it's amazing that these organizations are coming together and doing that, but that should not be the role. The role at that point should be to elevate. The role at that point should be to build up. And so, yes, when we're talking about strategies, there is a political strategy there. There is a political and a governmental strategy there. And then, from a business lens, we then get to have that whole PPP partnership, right? That public-private partnership, and that way in which we can support, whether that is agriculture, whether that is healthcare, whether that's technology, whether that is innovation. Because otherwise, we're always almost going to be starting on the back foot. And now in the world of AI and everything that is happening, we have great potential, but we're having to accelerate that. And what does the acceleration look like without every partner pulling their weight? So,
awesome. The role of infrastructure is indeed important, as we've heard from our panelists. If I can remind the audience, nearly over half a century ago, we got into a pandemic, COVID-19. And vaccine equity became a real conversation, and the role of local production of vaccine in African countries. Dr. Elsa, given your experience in this sector, what role do knowledge transfer and implementation of trade-related aspects of IP rights play in enabling African countries to develop their own capabilities in biotech and pharmaceutical innovation, particularly the topic of vaccine production?
No, that's a great question because as we know, Africa's population is, of course, exponentially growing. It's the largest continent and en route to be the largest continent. And so when we talk about commodities, right, we talk about, yes, there's agriculture, there's raw materials, but knowledge, right? What is what we get to create? How are we protecting that? And how are we using that both from a global perspective, but also from a local perspective? Now, the TRIPS agreement is one that was created. The TRIPS agreement is a trade-related aspect when it comes to intellectual property rights over 40 years ago. And the pharmaceutical industry is one that actually commercialized on this, predominantly protecting its rights towards how it develops vaccines, how it develops medications and drugs, etc. That being said, something that was put in was also having a TRIPS waiver and instances where this TRIPS agreement should no longer hold. And one of that was a force majeure, and I'm sure everyone would agree that COVID-19 pandemic in many ways was a force majeure. When you looked at one, who's developed these vaccines, great, these companies have developed these vaccines, and yes, being able to supply them to the global market. What then happened in COVID was that wealthier nations were having access to these vaccines and very much holding supplies, et cetera, and a lot of things around that. Then the conversation became, how do you increase access to these vaccines, right? Increasing access to these vaccines became a challenge because they just did not exist. And so a lot of pharmaceutical companies based in South Africa, even in India, were going, okay, well, why don't you waive the IP rights and do the knowledge transfer so that we can actually develop these on the continent and actually supply those? A lot of rebuttals came, and some of them were going, well, the populations are not going to take the vaccines, they don't need it. There's a perception about hesitancy around vaccine uptake within African nations. But my point to that was very much, it has always been, that is not the real argument. The argument is that it should be made available as it's been done everywhere in the world, and then we all have agency to make a decision as to whether we want to take it or not. That's not to say even in the UK, in the US, that it had 100% uptake. It did not. At least it was available and people were actually able to make those decisions. Now, unfortunately, we saw this completely play out, whereby a lot of companies then, again, similar to the epidemic, we're now trying to stand up manufacturing companies almost overnight and increase our production of vaccinations and everything in between. But then this is where we go back to. When these companies, when we merge private and public, Moderna creates a vaccine. Who purchases? The UK government, the US government, etc. Where do they purchase it from? From the budgets that they have created to be able to do this. Flip that back again in an African context. If we're not investing into the healthcare sector, even if an African company from a business perspective says, yes, I am going to manufacture these vaccines, who are they going to sell it to? Who's going to buy it? And of course, from a business perspective, that's null and void. Like, why will I create a product that I know that the governments are actually not going to purchase and not going to buy it, and that I perhaps may not commercialize it on the global landscape because they've sourced it from some other scenarios. So it's this knowledge of what we have, but then how do we take that to market, and who is the end consumer, and who's going to support the economy to be able to do it. Goes back to infrastructure, right? So, yeah.
Yes.
To that, because I think that's where, governments, irrespective of where these vaccines were distributed in the world, it arrived to people at no cost at the point of access. So government paid for it. The government was able to pay for it in other parts of the world because they have a tax system of some sort that works. And I just want to come back again to systems. So infrastructure, but there is a tax system that is working in other parts of the world that allows government to procure it even on the death of the great-grandchildren that are yet to be born, and then deliver it, right? So in Africa, we really need that infrastructure, the systems that have to be in place.
Thank you. I would like to shift the conversation slightly, and we can come back to knowledge share while protecting local industries in a minute. But access to capital is of great need. Dr. Nyambi, you mentioned earlier on, and Dr. Elsa, you also mentioned the reliance on foreign aid. Dr. Nyambi, you've spent over 24 years in international development, deploying capital to markets in different structures. What are the key factors that attract investors to the African market? And how can we create these innovative investment vehicles to boost the growth and enhance competitiveness of the African economies?
Yeah, no, great question. I think the African market, when I sit, I've been listening yesterday, everybody talks about Africa is the next frontier, is the next dividend. Africa cannot continue to be the place where people extract from, right? So it has to stop being extractive. And for it to stop being extractive, I think that is where, for me, that next frontier, we need to take products, just keep using cocoa and chocolate, right, to the final, to the end product and everything. We need to, in Africa, before I even come to the capital markets, sure, we consume Toyota, and sure, Toyota has manufacturing plants across Africa, but when is Africa going to have its own Tata? I think Tata is a vehicle from India. So, because I think for me, before we even talk about capital, Africa needs to begin to look at itself not as a consumer, not as a recipient of aid. Aid has never transformed any part of the world. There is no, if anybody knows any country that has transformed itself by aid, please, they should put up their hand and name that country to me. There's none that I know of, right? That aid is what transformed them. So, and that is why I said aid is a bridge. Aid is a bridge. Sometimes, there's situations where you need, some support, but it cannot be the destination. It cannot be the destination, and so on. Yesterday, I think the head of the school, he said, you turn around before you know it, Trump's name comes up, right? And absolutely, his name comes up. And if Africa, I want us to use this opportunity and this moment as Africa to reconstruct, how our development is going to take place, rather than trying to rebuild what had not worked, right? So we shouldn't do that. And with that, capital, again, as I said, there's capital that is external, but there's capital within. Our pension plans, our people are working, they're contributing their money. We have high net worth individuals. We are the richest continent when it comes to resources. If we can take those resources, add value, finalize, make the best diamonds, Botswana, do not send those diamonds off to Belgium. Let us cut the rings, everything, and we sell them there in Botswana, out of Africa. We will be able to then look and say, the spectrum or the view of what development is for Africa is not going to be aid reliant. It's going to be then reliant on how we progress economically. Again, let me say, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be need for some aid. And moving a little bit backwards again, let us look at our leaders. I was so happy the governor was here yesterday, from Katsina State, right? There is no way, some of us come as organizations, and where I sit in Canada, I tell the government of Canada, you cannot go to anybody's country and say you've come to develop their country without that government sitting at the table. I am really sorry. That government has its mandate for its people, the people of Guinea, as you went there. You could come with everything and set up, but at the end of the day, the Guinea president, they have the mandate for the Guinea people, not somebody who comes from outside. So I really think that, when it comes to capital, it is how we figure out to redistribute it so that people is access. As you said, let people have access to it, then they can make a choice of, I want to access it this way, I want to access it through another means, and so on. And last but not the least, just to say, the way capital has been brought to the continent, a lot of development, a lot of that money has come at such a cost, right? You go to a woman in Kisumu in Kenya, and they take a loan of 500 and they're paying you 30-40% interest, right? To an organization, somebody who is going to take it and go and sit in Luxembourg. So at the end of the day, what has happened? You've just worked and broken your back to serve for somebody to buy a lake cottage, somewhere, in Europe. So just to say that, there's money on the continent. Let us use that money. Let us make it work for our people. We know how to do it, and it will build, a replacement. We really do need political leadership. So I'm sending that message to the governor and all his peers.
Great. So we've discussed foreign direct investments. We've discussed knowledge transfer. I want to ask a very controversial question. Not so much controversial per se, but we've spoken about opening our economies, allowing foreign direct investments and knowledge transfer, but then how do we balance the benefits of attracting foreign direct investments, sharing our intellectual property, and protecting local industries? Any one of you want to take that?
I will start by saying, really a story. I was engaging with someone I recently met. She's a lawyer, an entertainment lawyer based in the US, and she also works in Nigeria. And something she was talking to me about was the fact that she sits on a lot of her teams, her artist teams, when she looks at the legal contracts between her artist teams that are based in Nigeria versus the teams based in the US. And she was like, the magnitude of what they were getting paid was at least a 10x or a 15x. And her point was, because she sits on that duality, right, of both continents, she was able to go, hang on a minute, and advise her clients on the Nigerian side that you're not getting a fair representation. You can push on this and you should push on that. So when we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about protection, and we're talking about local production, there's so many things at stake there, right? So you're talking about your own innovation, your own thoughts as an entertainer and what you have created. You're talking about the legal contracts in which that allows you to monetize on that. And then, of course, you're talking about the scale at which you get to do that. Is that within, let's say, just Africa/Nigeria in that case, or if you're going to the US? We need to be able to create systems or teams that allow people who have views of all of them. And that is as much multinational as basically being global. Because without that, it's difficult to be able to state that this is a protection, one, of what I have created. Two, it is a fair representation on both the local market and the international market. And you should not have to restrict yourself, right, out of fear or out of concern about, well, if I went to this specific market, would I be fairly compensated or would I be taken advantage of? So it's just bringing together very many teams who have experience on both ends is probably what I would say on that.
Just to add to that, there's, for example, there's a lot of work going on malaria vaccine research and everything, and a lot of that work is happening in Africa. And my question is, those researchers who are working on malaria, how much of that have they gone and made legal counsel to patent as their own kind of result, as their own kind of method? Okay, go ahead, Elsa. Because go ahead.
Conversation here, right?
Yes.
Which is, the challenge there is that who has funded the research? You can't patent research that has been funded from specific bodies, right? When you're looking at those legal rights, and that goes back to the top of this conversation, which is because we live in the ecosystem that we live in, we then end up not being able to even conduct research that is innovative enough that you can go down the route of saying, I'm going to patent it, because you have to do R&D. Now in the UK, you have the likes of Innovate UK and or Wellcome Trust and so many other organizations that will fund it and that could allow you to do that. How are those organizations funded, right? What do we have in Africa?
And I think that is it. And that is where I said, if we were able to, in Africa, add value to our own resources, whatever that product is that they say, you find it only in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that serves all our cell phones, right? Cobalt, there you go. So if we could take that cobalt and we were then the people, we don't send that cobalt elsewhere, we're actually making the phones, then I think we'll then have the resources to fund our own research, right? So it is how do we begin to build? Because I think if we understand these gaps, Miriam, then we start to build towards solving for them, knowing that to able to have the patents to our own ideas and say, let those ideas then serve the world, we need to fund them ourselves, right? So, and then again, it is about, it's not aid, right? Because the person who has come and given you research and aid, they own the rights, right? So we're still not free, through aid. So again, if Donald Trump has decided that aid is out the door, let's rethink, right? And actually use it as an opportunity.
We would have loved to extend the session and continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we will not have time for questions, so I'll turn to my panelists and say, in this room we have a diverse background of people. We have change makers, investors, and MBA students who are going to go into the job market. In a few words, what is your parting shot or actionable advice that you can offer to ensure that we are all catalysts for change in the global economic landscape, particularly in shaping Africa's role on the world stage?
I think for me, very quickly, it is that everybody has a role. Like, there's nothing like a small role. I heard it yesterday, and I'll just repeat. There's nothing like a small role. Everybody, no matter where you sit, wherever you sit, you can do your best and keep the big picture in view, right? And not just the disappear where you're doing it. I think there's opportunity for everybody. Also, I think the world is now at a place where, as young Africans, you come with a lot of agency. Use it, bring it to the table. People may not like it and everything, but they would have heard it. So do something about it, and if you see a gap, try to figure out a solution. So I say nothing is too small, and be bold. It takes time, but you have to be bold and courageous.
I'll say, well, two words I had, which is one, you've touched on one of the words, agency and urgency. Agency in being able to draw that line from whatever that problem you're trying to solve all the way to either capital, raising investment, really raising investment, but more so profitability and sustainability of a specific business, or impact, however criteria you want to use to measure that. But even on the agency point, I will double click and actually mention something that someone told me a couple of days ago, which was, when you're going into business and when you're starting off on this agency perspective, you're going to get asked a lot of questions and going to get pushback, and it might be steeped in bias, it might not be steeped in bias. But just to whatever question you hear, answer what you actually want them to hear. You don't necessarily have to answer the question, but using that opportunity to state the facts that you actually want to put across. And of course, urgency. There's no better time to start than now. So.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a great conversation. Unfortunately, we couldn't have questions, but please feel free to reach out to the panelists and continue this conversation. As we've had, we will need to build the infrastructure. We need to be more flexible with the knowledge transfer, and it's never too late. Start now. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.